Okay, welcome back and to the start of Unit 11, everyone. This unit was supposed to include um, apartheid, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and some of the reforms that occurred in China during the 1980s. Unfortunately, since we're pretty pressed for time with the end of the school year coming up, we're not going to get to most of that. We're definitely not going to get to the China stuff. We're probably only going to be able to touch upon the collapse of the Soviet Union a little bit on Monday. Um, but today we're going to talk about apartheid, pretty much picking up right where we left off with South Africa earlier in the year when we were talking about imperialism and European colonization of South Africa. So, like I said, where we left off with South Africa. If you recall, earlier in the year we talked about how the Dutch and then later the British colonized South Africa. And we had left off with the end of the Second Boer War, in which the British defeated the Boers, the descendants of the original Dutch settlers, and ended the war by annexing both of the independent Boer republics, the Orange Free State and the Republic of the Transvaal, also known as the South African Republic. You see on that map there, Natal, they had already annexed that earlier. That was another Boer republic. So they had all these territories, and in 1910, they unified all of them into a single self-governing dominion known as the Union of South Africa. I do want to jump back just a little bit and start by talking about some of the precursors to apartheid. Unfortunately, for as long as Europeans have been there, systemic racism codified in law has been a part of South African society. And that really began with the early Dutch settlers who brought with them, in order to work the land, several ethnically diverse groups of slaves. I say ethnically diverse groups because while most of them came from various regions of Africa, some did come from elsewhere. There were, for example, some slaves brought from parts of Dutch India and other regions of the world as well. So predominantly slaves of African origin, but there were some from some other regions of the world. Even when the British took over and annexed the colony, at least the Cape Colony, slavery was initially still allowed, but they did abolish it in 1833. However, most of the slave owners were able to get around that abolition simply by changing the official status of their slaves to indentured workers. I don't know the exact specifics about how that worked and how that got around the law and how they were allowed to do that. But I imagine as long as someone wasn't considered legally your property and a slave for life, as long as they were just an indentured worker or an indentured servant, I guess that was somehow still allowed. So there was always this sort of I guess, hierarchy and dominance by the white colonizers of the region. And the British really didn't do anything to change that. They maintained a very rigid racial hierarchy. Like I said a second ago, the white colonists at the top, free people of color below that, slaves slash indentured servants below that, but very strict racial stratification and hierarchy. Likewise, we learned about the Great Trek earlier in the year when the Boers, in order to escape increased British control over the Cape Colony, went on a long journey to resettle in the interior of South Africa, kind of up to the northwest, or the northeast, I should say. And we learned about how that brought them into increasing conflict with the region's native African population. In particular, we learned about their conflicts with the Zulu and how that led to the Anglo-Zulu War. So the Dutch settlers and their descendants, the Boers, and then later the Afrikaners, who are, I guess you might say, the descendants of the Boers. They're really Boers, but they changed their name and now referred to as Afrikaners, have always been kind of in conflict with the region's native African population and have always kind of fought for dominance. So catching back up to where we were. So once the Union of South Africa, a new self-governing dominion, came into existence, these racist laws became even stricter. I want to emphasize again, this is self-governance for the Union of South Africa, but it is white self-governance. No people of color, no Africans, or anything like that were allowed any participation in government. This was self-governance by the descendants of the white colonists. And like I said, so they passed even stricter racist laws once they gained that self-governance. An infamous example of that were the pass laws, which were a series of laws that basically set up an internal passport system. If you wanted to go somewhere, you had to have the proper papers to allow for that movement. And this whole system really was designed to restrict the movement of Africans and other people of color, restrict their opportunities, and enforce segregation, legal segregation. Okay, moving on to the origins of apartheid itself, which would take that already existing racism to an even more extreme version of systemic segregation and oppression. Things really started with World War II. Now, just as an aside, I want to point out that as a self-governing dominion of the British Empire, South Africa fought on the side of the Allies, of course. However, many Boers, or Afrikaners as they were starting to be referred to as, were actually sympathetic to Germany, and that stemmed mainly from their ethnic background. Although they were primarily of Dutch origin, there were quite a few German settlers as well who had since intermarried and mingled with the Boers. So they did have a historical ethnic connection to Germany. And of course, there was just their shared opposition to the British. So again, many of the Boers were actually sympathetic to the Germans. But moving back to apartheid and to its origins with internal factors. So the war, of course, led to shortages of labor, as many white South Africans went to fight in the war. A shortage of labor developed that led many black workers to move to the city. They had previously worked on farms and in more rural parts of the country, but they now flocked to the cities, and that of course led to overcrowding and all those other problems that are commonly associated with urbanization and industrialization that we learned about a little bit earlier in the year. The white-controlled government failed to adjust for any of these issues, to adjust to this surge in urbanization with any sort of increase in housing or social services or anything you really need to help alleviate any of these problems. And as a result, disillusionment over that led blacks and other people of color to increasingly turn to a new generation of leaders, particularly political leaders, who are pushing for more personal freedoms and rights. Now, during the war itself, the ruling white United Party had actually relaxed segregation a little bit, but certainly not enough really to eliminate the obviously already existing systemic racism that was going on. Likewise, many Afrikaners, again, Afrikaners are pretty much the Boers. But just from now on, I'm going to refer to the descendants of the Dutch as Afrikaners because that's what they came to be referred to as. They also reacted very negatively to these changes, and they increasingly turned against the United Party for being what they viewed as too soft on racial integration. They looked back, they saw all of the issues that were happening in society. So while all of the people of color were disillusioned, so were the Afrikaners, and they turned against their own ruling United Party. And that led us to the election of 1948. And in that election, the Afrikaner Nationalist National Party won the election. They had been in existence for a while, but again, the United Party had pretty much for the entire history of the Union of South Africa been the dominant party. The Afrikaner Party, led by D.F. Malan, who you can see on the left there, won the election. He became prime minister, and they had run on a platform of extending segregation to all parts of life. Previously, it had existed primarily in what were considered, I guess, major matters like education and politics, but they pushed for it to extend to literally every single part of life in order to ensure continued white dominance over South Africa. And they referred to this policy that they were putting forward as apartheid, which in Afrikaans, the Afrikaner language, means apartness. I think it literally means like apart held or apart hold, but it means essentially apartness or separateness. So I just said that apartheid was a policy of extreme segregation, but how exactly did that work? To start, it meant the forced segregation of society into four different racial groups. Those four groups were whites, blacks, Asians, and coloreds. Coloreds being pretty much anyone of mixed race. It also included the banning of pretty much any contact at all between races, with a few rare exceptions, and set up completely different schools, hospitals, libraries, etc. Pretty much, again, every part of society uh, existed in this extremely strict segregation. It also established what were called homelands, or in the case of cities, townships. And what those were racially segregated areas, usually incredibly underdeveloped, where non whites were forced to live. They were often forcibly relocated to those areas from other areas that had been designated now as whites only. And one of the most infamous relocations, which I'm going to have you watch a video about in a little bit, was District 6 in Cape Town, which had been a thriving community of many different races, but was declared a whites only area by the government. And most of the people there were forced to relocate to a much less desirable part of the city, and their homes, businesses, pretty much everything were completely demolished, and nothing was ever really built there in its place. They built, I think, a small college, but outside of that, it's pretty much just empty fields. A really horrible and infamous example of this relocation or policy of relocating people to homelands and townships. And lastly, I just want to point out that blacks formed approximately 75% of the population of South Africa, but they were only allowed to own approximately 13% of the land. And as I'm sure you can imagine, that certainly was not the best land either. The best land was reserved for the whites. The main black opposition to apartheid came to center around the African National Congress, or the ANC. It had actually been founded all the way back in 1912, but it really had been ineffective, had been a non-entity before the implementation of apartheid, before all of this systemic racism started to get much, much worse. At first, they organized nonviolent boycotts and protests, and those achieved very little. They made very little headway in breaking down the apartheid system. And ultimately, events would later turn them into a much more militant group. And you'll see about those events in just a second. One of the first events that started to, I guess you could say, force a change to the status quo was the Sharpeville Massacre, which occurred in 1960. Now, it began as a peaceful protest by around 7,000 people. They were protesting against those pass laws that we talked about earlier. They had shown up at a police station to turn themselves in for symbolically destroying their passbooks, which were essentially those internal passports that I mentioned. And over the course of the day, the crowd grew larger and apparently more hostile. Exactly what happened isn't clear. There are varying reports. Some reports say that they started throwing stones at the police and then advanced on the police compound. Others insist that this protest remained completely peaceful. Again, it's not completely clear which of those is the case, but regardless of why, the police ended up firing on the crowd and killed 69 people and injured 180. Now, this rightfully angered the black community, which flew into quite an uproar, justifiably so. And the government responded to the increased protests by banning the ANC and imprisoning many of its leaders, including Nelson Mandela, although this was not the case that ultimately got him imprisoned for many, many years. He was ultimately released for this one, later sent to prison in a different case. Just as an aside, I'm not going to talk too much about Nelson Mandela today in this PowerPoint. I think I'm going to mention him once more near the end. That's not because I'm trying to intentionally overlook him, but simply because on Friday I'm going to have you watch a biography of him, a video biography of him that's going to go into far more detail about him and give you a far better understanding of who he was than I could ever hope to do in this PowerPoint. So again, not intentionally trying to overlook Mandela and his role in all of this. He's obviously very, very important. I'm just gonna let the video do most of the talking about him. And as a result of being banned by the government and forced underground, the ANC did become more militant, or at least it started to become more militant, and began using tactics like car bombs and assassinations. They realized that their peaceful boycotts and protests hadn't been getting anywhere. The police had responded to those peaceful protests with violence, and they felt that new tactics were needed. Some other events that contributed to this long and slow change to the status quo were the Soweto Uprising and the Steve Biko, I guess you could call it an incident. You'll see what it is in a second. The Soweto Uprising occurred in 1976, and it started as another protest, this time by students who were protesting a new government requirement that Afrikaans, the Afrikaner language, be used to teach in school rather than indigenous African languages. These protesting students apparently threw stones at the police, who then shot at the crowd and killed 23 people. There was a huge uproar and massive riots broke out that lasted from June until the end of the year. And by the time they quieted down, 500 people were dead and thousands more were wounded. Really caused an uproar not just in South Africa, but in the international community as well. And then the following year, a black leader with ties, I believe, to the African National Congress, the ANC, by the name of Steve Biko, and that's a picture of him there on the right. He was detained by the police and placed in solitary confinement. He was later found dead in his cell, the result of very severe and brutal police beatings. And his killing, his murder, set off even more international outrage, really through the roof this time. This was quite a big deal. Again, not just in South Africa, but in the world as a whole. And these events, again, really, I guess you could say, started to up the pressure. As international outrage grew, demands for change and pressure on the South African government grew as well. One of the leaders calling on the international community to exert increased pressure on the South African government to end apartheid was Archbishop Desmond Tutu, a really great and really important man. Alongside Nelson Mandela, he's probably one of the most respected, I should say he is one of the most respected and well-known anti-apartheid campaigners. And he is a black Anglican bishop, Anglican meaning the Church of England and its offshoots throughout the world, of course. And he later, in 1986, became the Archbishop of Cape Town, which is the most senior position, the top bishop in the Anglican Church of South Africa. In the early 1980s, when he was already a bishop, I forget where he was the bishop of, but he started to call on the international community to place an economic embargo on South Africa, to use economic sanctions and economic means to basically force the South African government to start dismantling apartheid. And that effort was very successful. He did get many countries to respond with severe trade restrictions on South Africa and its government. And South Africa was even banned completely from the 1984 Summer Olympics, which, might not hurt necessarily economically, but certainly, in terms of publicity, is clearly a big deal. Everyone would have heard about that and known about that. That would have been quite quite a measure, a protest against them. Eventually, this pressure finally began to work, and the South African government did begin to allow more freedoms, particularly politically. As a result of his efforts, Desmond Tutu was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1984. And like I said, he went on to become the Archbishop of Cape Town. He retired, I think, in the early 90s at some point. Still alive as far as I know, but he's retired now. Still makes appearances from time to time, I think, for humanitarian causes around the world. Now, eventually, that international pressure was successful in helping to bring about the end of apartheid, and that end really began in 1989 with the election of F.W. de Klerk as president of South Africa. Now, de Klerk was the National Party candidate, and he had campaigned on preserving apartheid. He had promised to maintain that system. However, pretty much as soon as he was in office, he immediately began to institute serious reforms. Most notably, he lifted the ban on the ANC, and he freed Nelson Mandela and several other important black leaders. And that allowed negotiations to begin that ultimately led over the following 18 months or so to the South African Parliament repealing most apartheid laws. So most of the legal mandates for all of that segregation and oppression were repealed. And all of that ultimately culminated in 1994 in free multi-party elections in which black participation was allowed. Everyone was finally allowed to vote, not just whites. And in that election, the ANC won 63% of the vote, and Nelson Mandela was elected president. And that obviously was the end of apartheid itself. Although there are still some significant problems in South Africa that we're going to look at in just a second. Things have generally been trending upwards since then. Just to look real quick at some of those continuing problems before we go. Again, things have in general been trending up, but there are still some issues remaining. Firstly, there is still a huge opportunity and standard of living gap between blacks and whites in South Africa. I think, if I remember the statistic correctly, whites are on average 6 times as wealthy as blacks. Kind of related to that, in many areas of the country, de facto segregation still exists. Again, not de jure, so not by law, but de facto segregation, in actuality, because many blacks and other people of color simply cannot afford to move. So they still continue to live in the neighborhoods that they were previously essentially forced to live in. There is a huge HIV and AIDS crisis that, if you think about the timeline, in the late 80s, early 90s, that crisis really started to hit South Africa right as apartheid was ending. And because so much focus was elsewhere, it wasn't really addressed right away, and it got out of hand and is still a huge issue there. And lastly, the ANC has been in power continuously since 1994. So while it's great that they finally have majority rule there, they've had this one party running the country since 1994. And as a result of that, and as a result of the retirement and ultimately, unfortunately, deaths of so many of their initial leaders, it has now become increasingly corrupt. The previous president, whose name, Jacob Zuma, that's his name, actually had to resign for corruption-related reasons. And as a result of all that, opposition does seem to be slowly beginning to emerge. There's no serious and clear opposition yet, but the ANC does seem to be beginning to lose its grip a little bit on power. The downside to all of that, of course, is Afrikaner nationalism, which is in many ways pretty much white nationalism, white supremacy, is once more on the rise in South Africa.